Hello friends, today we are starting a new series, The Making of Contemporary India from 1950 to 1990s, and we will cover the various topics which are there in this particular theme. And as we are aware that the period is from 1950 onwards, when the constitution came into force, their way from 1949-50 onwards, and we find that during this particular period, apart from the constitutional developments which took place and how the constitution played an important role in the lives of the people, giving them the kind of trust which they required after the barbarous colonial rule, and the constitution with its features of fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, the universal suffrage, all these kinds of things which were initiated in the constitution. It provided a lot of hope to the people in terms of getting the ideas of equality, getting the kind of freedom which was not there with them. But at the same time, we have to realize the kind of problems or the challenges which were there before that, the partition of India which took place in 1947, and the kind of violence which was perpetrated during the partition violence. We find that so many people, they lost their lives, so many people they had to be rehabilitated because they were being displaced from their own homeland, they were being called refugees in their own homeland. So that was the kind of a situation which was there, and the kind of economic distress which was caused due to the colonial rule, which was exploitative in nature. So Indians at that point of time, 1950 and thereafter, they were trying to build the nation in some way, and that is how we see that the idea of nation building could be seen during this particular period. And when we tend to understand this particular period, we can refer to certain books like Bipin Chandra et al., India Since Independence, Ramchandra Guha's India After Gandhi, B.L. Grover, An Introduction to Modern India. These are some of the books which you can refer. B.R. Nanda's Indian Women from Parda to Modernity, Rachel Dyer and Christopher Pinney edited Pleasure and the Nation, the History, Politics and the Consumption of Public Culture in India. So these are some of the readings. There are so many others apart from them of this particular period, but some of them, they can be referred to understand this particular period, because these 50 years we have variety of themes in these 50 years which we are going to discuss, beginning from the Constitution of India. And we find that when Constitution was in a way introduced in India, the way it was being enforced, and how Congress is a political party, it became more prominent as late as 1970s, and thereafter when it again revived in 1980s for a period of around 9 years, from 80 to 89. So we find that there were other political parties as well, but we find that Congress ruled for a considerable period of time, and the kind of benefit it had, because it was the premier party during the Indian national movement, and all the big leaders, they were in some way associated with the Congress. So that is how the political developments of this particular period, they could be seen. And at the same time, when we try to understand in the terms of the ideas, that the kind of changes, the kind of things which were to be initiated, I talked about the idea of nation building, that how India had to be built again because of the devastation which had been caused by the colonial rule, and India became a very poor country because of the economic exploitation of India at all levels by the British. And at the same time, we also find that the people, those who were associated in the political sphere and in other spheres as well, they had to bring, they have to build some kind of a democratic and a civil libertarian society, and people were not literate from that point of view, because the education system which Indians had, that had also been in a way devastated by the colonial rule, and the way modern education was being thrust on the Indians. So we find that economic development had to take place, and it had to take place within a democratic political structure which was introduced because of the Constitution of India. And when we talk about the independent India, we talk about the ideas of nationality and the citizenship, that how the people, those who were now called citizens, how these people, they had right to vote, and everyone was treated equally because of the fundamental rights, and they had redressal mechanisms in the framework of right to constitutional remedies, and the various kinds of laws, they treated all Indians as equal. So these were some of the things they were being initiated during this particular period. And we also find in the framework of the linguistic reorganization of the state, that how states, they were being reorganized on the lines of the language, and how language as a strong cultural component became very, very important at that point of time. We will also talk about that. And the foreign policy and the making of the non-alignment, that how foreign policy was also very, very important at that point of time, and the idea of NAM, non-aligned movement, how it got associated with the foreign policy. And when we talk about the constitution, we talk about that how the preamble of the constitution, it contains the ideals and the aspirations of the people, and the terms like sovereign, socialist, secular and democratic republic, how these terms, they have very specific meanings, and how it also is the basic structure of the constitution. Preamble is considered to be the basic structure, and how the laws, they should not be made which in a way come in conflict with the basic structure of the constitution. There was a case called the Keshavanand Bharati case, in which it was being talked about. And when we talk about the objectives of the preamble, then it talks about securing justice, liberty, equality to all the citizens, and to promote fraternity, to maintain unity and integrity of the nation. So objectives of the preamble are also communicating that the kind of things which have to be given to the Indians through the Constitution of India. And we find that when you talk about the constitution, then fundamental rights, they are being talked about, and these fundamental rights are the individual rights which are enforceable in nature, and they are in a way limitations on the power of the state. At the same time, they are not absolute in nature, because certain restrictions are also there in the framework of the fundamental rights. So when you talk about the fundamental rights, you can go to courts because they are enforceable when you feel that your rights are infringed by the state in some way, and they are in a way try to limit the power of the state as well, because we find that if the state is behaving in a fashion where your fundamental rights are infringed, then there are seen to be some sort of limitations on the power of the state. But at the same time, as individuals, as citizens of the country, we have also to be very careful that these rights are not absolute in nature, and certain restrictions which are there in that context, that in certain cases the government can also indulge in the curtailment of the rights, but in the normal situation you can seek any kind of redress when your rights, they are being infringed by the government. At the same time, we find that apart from the fundamental rights, the directive principles, they are seen to be the positive obligations. They are not enforceable in the court of law, but they constitute some sort of a social and economic democracy. And the ideas of universal suffrage, nationality, single citizenship, all they are also enshrined in the Constitution of India. So we find that all these kinds of features, for example, directive principles as a feature, they try to communicate the kind of welfare measures in which the government should indulge in, because the directive principles, they ask the government, they in a way provide some kind of a guidance to the government, that government should function in certain ways, so that more and more people they can be provided all sorts of welfare in terms of their social and economic standing. And when one is provided the right to vote in terms of universal suffrage without any kind of distinctions, then this kind of an opportunity is given to the person where he is considered to be equal, and the only limitation is in the context of age, and that from 21 it was being reduced to 18 by the government. But all the citizens of India, those who are beyond that age, they have the right to vote. And we also find that during this particular period certain important issues which were being tackled by the government at different levels. For example, the idea where the states were to be reorganized on the issue of the language, and various committees they were being established. Dhar committee, JVP committee, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Pattabhi Sitaramaiah, all of them they were part of this committee, and the State Reorganization Commission under Justice Fazal Ali. So we find that in the context of the linguistic reorganization in Andhra, Potti Sri Ramulu, who in a way fasted unto death, that on the question of the linguistic reorganization, and when finally this kind of a decision when it was took that the states they had to be organized on the basis of the language, and there was a lot of debate with regard to whether languages, when you will divide the states on the basis of language, whether it is some sort of a unifying factor or a divisive factor. And at the same time, as you can see on the screen as well, the idea or the policy of unity in diversity, it was also being talked about during that particular period. And single language for the state administration, when you will have the linguistic reorganization of the states, and it will also give some kind of fillip to the growth of regional languages. So what we find is that when the states they will be reorganized on the basis of the language, then whether it will create some kind of division within the Indian state, or whether all states, when they will have their own particular languages, they will feel some kind of unity or affinity towards the Indian state. So when we try to see this kind of a situation, then we find that linguistic reorganization worked very well in the context of India. And in terms of state administration, single language, which was the vernacular language of the state, was very important from the point of view of the mother tongue of those particular people, those who are living in that particular state. And this idea of unity in diversity, whether we may have all sorts of differences in terms of language, in terms of eating habits, in terms of culture, but we have this kind of a unity even in that diversity, and this kind of an idea was propagated during that period of time. And it will also provide some kind of help to the regional languages, because if these regional languages they will not be even spoken in the states to which they are native to, then they will vanish away in a period of time. So that is what some kind of a thrust to the regional languages will also take place. In the context of the kind of changes which are being talked about during this period, in the context of the foreign policy, we find that the idea of Panchashil, as you can see on the screen as well, mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. So India and China, both of them, they talked about Panchashil, and these were the ideas which were associated with Panchashil. And when you talk about the Indian foreign policy, especially when India became independent in 1947 and thereafter, we find that India was talking about the non-aligned movement, or NAM, and where India did not have to align with any other country or state, because that was the situation at that point of time, and because of the Cold War situation where USA and USSR they became two most powerful power blocks. And when these power blocks were in a way struggling for asserting more and more power, then we find that some or the other country they joined them. And because of this Cold War situation, India felt that because India was under the colonial rule, it had undergone the imperial rule. It had also seen that the way economies they are being shattered, the way economies they are being exploited and misused by the people, those who are ruling these particular countries. So India wanted that more and more countries they should be liberated from the colonial rule, and when these countries they become liberated, then they may not be totally dependent on the country under which they were being ruled under earlier. So that was the kind of situation, and India wanted that the ideas of colonialism and imperialism they should not be there in the new world, where you find that more and more states or countries they should be liberated from any kind of bondage which was there. And when you talk about the kind of developments which were happening in this context, then the idea of 5-year plans in the economic sphere, we find that how the 5-year plans which were borrowed from USSR and the objectives of planning, we find that the increase in the national income and the per capita income, reduction in the inequalities of income and wealth. So when you talk about the objectives of planning which was initiated in 1951, and the first 5-year plan which came in 1951 to 1956, and the second 5-year plan from 56 to 61, third from 61 to 66, and from 66 to 69 we had rolling plan, and 69 to 74, and from 74 to 78. So these were the 5-year plans which were initiated at different points of time, and these 5-year plans, all of them, they had this kind of an idea that how the national income of India and the per capita income of Indians, that should be increased, and any sorts of reduction in the inequalities of the income and as well as the wealth, they should also be removed, and more opportunities should be provided to the people in terms of employment, in terms of providing them services, providing them all sorts of state facilities, so that any kind of inequality that can be removed. The other objectives of planning, when we talk about the ideas of modernization, we talk about the ideas of providing employment, we talk about the ideas of growth with stability, the idea of self-reliance. So all these kinds of things, they were being talked about in the 5-year plans, and the government at different levels, state at different level, it wanted that more and more people they are part of the production process, because unless they will be part of the production process, they will not be able to contribute to the economy, and when they will not be able to contribute to the economy, then the national income as well as the per capita income will not increase. And when you talk about the idea of self-reliance, we find that the country had to become more and more self-reliant, and you had to produce goods within your own country so that you can become more and more self-reliant. And at the same time, during this particular period, we find that how education system in India got destroyed because of the colonial rule, as British, they only focused on the English education, and the situation of education was bad from that point of view at the time of independence. So we find that some kind of a thrust to the education system was given during this period, and how at the level of the primary and secondary and the university education, it had to be promoted and was promoted at different points of time. And it was also talked about through the constitution that how children up to the age of 14, they had to be given free education, free and compulsory education at different levels. And we also find that during this time there was a lot of focus on the ideas of science and technology, and even in the constitution that we have to have some kind of a scientific bent of mind, we should have this kind of a bent. And some institutions like IITs, ISRO, etc., they were initiated and they were built during this period, and people got associated with these institutions, and over a period of time these institutions became some kind of a brand, and how they were revered in different parts of the world. And on the other hand, we see in certain regions you find that especially when you see the cases of Punjab and Bihar, where you will find some kind of an uneven development in both these states. And we also find that how green revolution, it was being introduced in India, and how because of the green revolution, if you try to see the impact on from the agricultural point of view, when it increased the production, but at the same time we find that the regions of Punjab became more prosperous, and the region of Bihar where it was not introduced, it declined over a period of time. So there is a story of the lopsided development which you see during this period because of this kind of an uneven development. So that also will be discussed, and we will also discuss about the kind of aspirations in the framework of democracy, that how the political formations like Congress and other political parties they also came up during this time, and how Congress as a major political party because of its involvement in the national movement, and how the members they were also part of other parties as well. But after independence this situation changes when single membership after independence was introduced by the Congress party. Then there were other parties like the Communist Party of India and Bharatiya Jang Sangh, and all these parties they were there at that point of time, and how they all of them in one way or the other, the opposition parties by keeping the government on the toes on the various issues by talking about all these kinds of ideas when they were in opposition, so that the government functions well. And the party which was in power, which was trying to in a way bring some kind of changes in not only in the political sphere but at the social end and the economic spheres, so that more and more involvement of the people within the in the economy takes place, and you find one finds that the economy becomes more and more prosperous. And there were other themes as well which we will discuss in our next lecture, where we will talk about the left parties, Naxalbari, caste politics, and the dividend movement. So all these kinds of things they will also be talked, apart from the other things which we will talk about, where we will talk about in the second part of the introduction. Thank you very much.